Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where we look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film but to almost entirely focus on the various aspects of the 3D, with just a short comment at the end about the film itself. And today we're looking at the 2018 Star Wars film Solo. This one was post-converted into 3D and it was a film with a troubled production, with its original directors being fired deep into the filming, and Ron Howard came in to mop things up and apparently reshoot a lot of the film. And I guess we'll never know what the original directors Chris Miller and Phil Lord had in mind for the film's 3D presentation, so it's Ron Howard who ends up taking the credit, or blame, for the way it looks here. And this is a dark film, and a lot of it isn't nice clear dark, maybe with that blue lighting that lots of films go with in dark scenes, but it's mostly a dark and murky film. Fine, so that was the artistic choice, but I don't imagine it's a choice that the stereographer would have embraced if he'd had any say in things, or if he was even present while the film was being put together. So it's dark right from the beginning, but there is some depth in these shots and it's reasonably well done, but I do think that 3D generally works better when it's more brightly lit, and you need to be able to clearly see the various elements that have been placed into 3D space for it to work. So you can see that it's maybe nice and moody looking, but this gloomy city view really does set the tone for the look of almost the entire film. Long shots like this basically never have anything interesting in the way of depth, and I'm sure that the filmmakers would say that that's an artistic choice, and perhaps it was, but I always wonder a bit whether there's a budgetary choice being made as well. It's fine to keep long shots fairly flat if you're looking for a natural look, but also of course it means that the conversion is easier and cheaper. In some films I'd completely support that decision, but in a film that's supposed to be a fun space romp, I'd have been a bit happier with some more effective 3D in these views. Another reason I think it's a shame that they didn't push some fun depth into these long shots is because they tend to be amongst the few views in the film where the shots last for any length of time, and that's another thing that I think 3D needs. So this shot's held a while, but there's very little depth in it. It's one of the reasons I love 3D photographs, because you can find yourself staring at a single stereo photo for literally minutes to explore and enjoy the view, and I think 3D just needs time to breathe. But throughout this film it never gets a chance. It's almost always being suffocated by very quick edits. And the gloomy look of the film isn't just because a lot of it takes place at night or late in the day, but virtually all of the interior shots are dimly lit too. So there's plenty of separation and space in this shot, nothing sensational, but it's well done. You'd imagine that trench warfare could offer some maybe obvious 3D views, perhaps looking down the length of the trench, but this film doesn't really make the most of this location, and even if it did you wouldn't be able to see much. A lot of the camera work is handheld too, often quite wobbly, and again, not the way to shoot a movie if you've got much serious interest in it being released in 3D. So shot after shot, there is plenty of quite good 3D, but the view's gone long before you're properly able to appreciate it, and I'm talking about 1 or 2 seconds. It's just not good. So views like this, with Solo climbing a ladder, look nice, but this shot's held for less than a second, which is a shame because it's otherwise quite an effective bit of 3D. All the framing in these two views is nice for 3D, and a good job's been done of creating a strong enough feeling of space and solidity, but they're not going to let you look at these views for more than a couple of seconds. As a 3D film fan, I generally get irritated by people talking about 3D glasses robbing films of light and colour, because on a well set up display that just isn't an issue. But in the case of Solo, all too often it felt like this drab and gloomy film was being excessively drained of light and colour, both of which are things being in very short supply in the film. So the 3D often tries to be good, but the editing style just never really lets it succeed. I think 2 of the best shots in the film are these views down on a train during a heist. One's a close view and one's a long shot, but they're both very nice pieces of 3D, or at least they would be if the shots were held for a sensible amount of time. So it's at this point that I have to remind myself that these are experienced and skilled filmmakers at work, and they want this to be a fast-paced film, which is great, but not so much if you're making a 3D film, which I strongly suspect they weren't. There are virtually no scenes in the entire film where it felt to me like they were putting it together in a way that was sympathetic to 3D filmmaking. So it's a nice relief when we come out of the gloom and emerge into daylight. Even if it is a subdued and low contrast daylight, but it's still a relief, not that there's any discernible 3D in this shot. People sometimes incorrectly complain about 3D looking like layers of cardboard cutouts, but that's an entirely fair description of how this scene looks. The mountains left and right look like they're flat, sitting just ahead of the background. And during that train heist, there are some quite good views of the train, looking forwards and backwards, with some good depth in the train, stretching deep into the screen, but obviously these are only held for a second or two. Stereo D, who did this conversion, has often thrown lens flare into strong 3D in previous films, but not here. This bit's put into a very mild piece of 3D space, and you can see here how the lighting is just odd for what's basically a kid's adventure film. It's like this most of the time. It's nice and moody maybe, but not very good if you want to get a clear view of the characters. Also, along with that lens flare, another example of this being a bit half-hearted is this view through the binoculars, where there's really very little effort been made to place any of the graphic overlays into 3D space. If you're a fan of 3D pop-out, then this film isn't going to satisfy you much. There's a little bit here and there, but nothing to get you excited. This is the strongest pop-out shot, with almost all of the gun from its stand forwards poking out of the screen. It's a very strong piece of negative parallax, but you've guessed it, this shot lasts for 1 second. When the film throws in a completely flat shot, and it doesn't even push it back behind the screen, I didn't really care, as it's not as if it suddenly took me out of an otherwise great 3D experience. Like Rogue One, this film doesn't give us a view of the jump to hyperspace in 3D, so whilst the distant Millennium Falcon there is clearly sitting in front of the blue light tunnel, the tunnel itself is flat. Rogue One did have a very good, albeit very brief, view of the streak of stars as the ship comes out of hyperspace, but this film doesn't do that, so there's nothing three-dimensional in the star streaks here. Rogue One rather perversely showed holograms in 2D, and this film does that as well, although there is a big hologram near the end of the film with a fairly shoehorned character reveal that is wrangled into three-dimensional space. Not brilliantly, but at least it was something. There's a shot where the camera pitches quite heavily left and right, and it's the kind of shot that can have you leaning in your seat, which, depending on the type of 3D glasses you're wearing, it can throw the 3D completely out of whack if you lean your head. So it's a good thing that the 3D here is really weak. There are a handful of shots that look like they might have been set up with some consideration of 3D, like the approach to these massive horns, or the structure on the ground here. They're okay in 3D, but maybe not as impressive as you might reasonably expect them to be. At one point they approach a giant cosmic cloud, which doesn't look as good as the one in Rogue One, but there is a moment where they fly into a tunnel of cloud, where the 3D is amongst the film's better views, even if it's still a bit gloomy. There's a spaceship chase where there's some quite nice depth and separation in the 3D, but you pretty much have to freeze frame it if you want to notice it. Now, I'm going to totally pull some figures out of the air here, but let's just say for the sake of argument it costs £15 million to do this conversion. And this doesn't look like a super expensive one to me. The quality and the strength just isn't up there. And let's say they charge an extra £2 per 3D ticket, so that means, what, 7 or 8 million 3D ticket sales brings that cost back to the cinema, so maybe double that to get the cost back to the studio. I'm guessing a film like this was aiming for $1 billion box office, which means, they're expecting 60 or 70 million people to buy a ticket, so if 20% of those ticket sales are for 3D screens, then it's worth doing a conversion. So like I say, I've completely pulled those figures out of my arse, but I'm putting myself in the shoes of a Disney accountant, because this 3D presentation feels to me like an accountant's decision and not an artistic one. So there is a bit of okay 3D here and there, but it tends to be hidden away in the darkness, or it's blink and you'll miss it, and on the whole, this is rather uninteresting and uninvolving 3D. It's dull in both senses of the word, without a single wow moment in the whole film, and it's never used with any power at points in the story where it might have helped. So a very quick word about the film itself. This was the first Star Wars film to fail, and fairly disastrously, at the box office. One of the reasons people give for that is that it came out just about half a year after the much despised Episode 8, but that does maybe bring into mind that quote from the legendary band Spinal Tap. They were still booing him while we were on stage. I thought this film was okay, but not much more than that, and I think it certainly didn't deserve to be a hit the size it needed to be just to break even. And whereas Rogue One took what had always been a slight story problem at the heart of Star Wars, and it made sense out of it, Solo takes Han's problem line from the original film about having done the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs, and it makes sense out of that, which I think is a good indicator of this film's comparative lack of ambition. I actually thought that Alden Ehrenreich was a perfectly okay Han Solo, and the character I thought wasn't done so well was weirdly Chewbacca, where it was very obviously not Peter Mayhew in the Wookiee suit, so the way he moved just didn't look right. And Donald Glover, I thought, was probably the standout charismatic performance, but there was some frankly weird stuff about him and the annoying robot that I could have done without. I thought it was okay as a minor spin-off film, but if you stripped away all the Star Wars elements from it and told the exact same story but with different character names, well, I don't think that's a film that would actually ever have been greenlit in the first place. And if I ever watch it again, I don't think I'll bother with the 3D version. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.